Look at any photograph of Central Australia taken from high above the surface, and something will start to bother you, even if you cannot name it at first. The mountains are flat, they are not weathered into the gentle, rolling shoulders that mountains in other countries have. They are not jagged, they are not pointed, they are not crowned with snow or split by ridges. They are flat, as if a blade the size of a continent had been drawn across the top of every peak between the Indian Ocean and the Coral Sea. And what you're looking at from the air is not really a landscape at all, but a wound that has been given 100 million years to heal. The geology textbooks have a word for this. They call it erosion. Slowly wore the highlands of this continent down to the stumps you see today. And you cannot really argue with that explanation, because no one was there to watch it happen. But tonight, while the rest of the world is busy and bright and loud, lay your head back into your pillow, close your eyes and listen, because there is another story written into the stones of this country, a story that the official survey maps will not quite admit to, a story that the tour guides will hint at and then back away from, a story that the elders of the oldest continuous culture on Earth have been telling in songs and in paintings and in the careful naming of places for somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years. The mountains of Australia, this story says, are not mountains. They are what is left of something that was cut down. Before we go any further, before we walk out together across this enormous, ancient, quiet country, do me one small favor. If this kind of long, slow, careful storytelling is the kind of thing that helps you drift, the kind of thing you want to wake up to having only half remembered, then tap the subscribe button now and tap the little bell beside it. That way, every time a new long-form story like this one is whispered into the dark, you will be there, ready with your eyes already beginning to close. Now turn the screen brightness all the way down. Place the phone face down beside you. Pull the blanket up to your shoulders. Let the weight of your body settle into the bed. Let your breathing slow on its own. And let me take it from here. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to travel together across the wide, slow continent of Australia, and we're going to stand at 20 different places where the surface of the Earth seems to be holding its breath. 20 formations that the official record explains, but never quite explains away. 20 sites where, if you allow yourself to think for just a moment that the textbook version is incomplete, the shape of the land begins to suggest a very different past. You do not have to believe any of it. You only have to listen. You can let the words pass through you like a slow tide. You can let your mind float just above the meaning of the sentences, the way a leaf floats just above the surface of still water. We are not here to convince you. We are here to walk slowly across the bones of an old country, and to look with curious and unhurried eyes at the strange and the unexpected and the unexplained. So settle in. We begin where everyone begins, in the red heart of the continent, with the most famous stump on the planet. Number 1. Uluru. You can drive for an entire day across the Northern Territory and see almost nothing. The road is straight, the sky is enormous, the earth on either side of the bitumen is a soft, dusty red, the colour of old brick, the colour of dried blood, the colour of something that has been baking in the sun for so long that it has forgotten it was ever any other shade. There are spinifex bushes, low and silver and stubborn, and there are desert oaks, tall and feathered and dark, and there is the occasional kangaroo. But for the most part, the country is empty, and then, somewhere in the late afternoon, you will see it. At first, it is only a faint blue shape sitting on the line where the land meets the sky. It looks like a cloud. It looks like a low storm front. It is so far away, and the air between you and it is so heavy with heat that it does not seem solid. But you keep driving, and the shape keeps growing. And slowly, over the course of an hour, the cloud becomes a wall, and the wall becomes a mountain, and the mountain becomes a thing that is so much larger than your imagination had prepared you for, that you will pull the car over, and you will get out, and you will simply stand and look. This is Uluru. This is the rock. This is the thing that, more than any other single object, the entire continent of Australia has chosen to put on its postcards, and on its tea towels, and on the cover of its tourism brochures. It is famous because it is enormous, and because it is the colour of a hot ember in the late light, and because it sits, alone, in the middle of the largest empty space in the southern hemisphere. It is famous because it is sacred to the Ananga people, who have been living within sight of it for at least 30,000 years, and possibly very much longer than that. And it is famous because it is, in the most literal and stubborn sense of the word, strange. The official explanation goes something like this. Around 550 million years ago, in a period of geological time so deep that the words for it begin to lose their meaning, a vast inland sea covered the centre of what is now Australia. Sediment piled up on the floor of that sea. Sand, mostly, layer upon layer of compacted grit, slowly hardening into the kind of coarse, iron-rich sandstone called arkose. Then the continents shifted the way they do, and the sea drained away, and the sandstone was tilted, almost vertically, by colossal forces moving deep within the earth. And then, over the next 300 or 400 million years, the softer rock around it eroded. The wind took some, the rain took more. The endless microscopic patience of weather took the rest. and what was left, sticking up out of the surrounding plain like the prow of a sunken ship, was Uluru. That is the textbook story. It is a perfectly reasonable story, and it is the story you will hear from the rangers, and from the audio guide, and from the museum at the visitor center, and from every guidebook in every airport bookshop. But here's the thing. When you actually stand at the base of the rock, and you look up, and you let your eye trace the line where the rock meets the air, that story does not feel quite right. The walls of Uluru are not weathered into curves. They are not gently rounded. They are sheer, vertical. In some places, they are slightly overhung, leaning out over the path, the way the walls of an old quarry sometimes lean over the spoil heap below them. The top of the rock is flat, not perfectly flat, not as flat as a tabletop, but flat in the way that a thing becomes flat after it has been broken off at a certain height. It is as if something has been removed from above, as if Uluru is not really a mountain at all, but the base of a mountain, the stump. And the stump is enormous, 348 meters tall above the surrounding plain, just under 3.5 kilometers long, 9.5 kilometers around, and then, beneath the surface, the rock continues. It does not stop where the desert floor begins. The same Arkose layer plunges down into the earth for at least another 2.5 kilometers, possibly more. Some geologists have suggested it goes down 5 or 6, which means that what you are looking at when you look at Uluru is the very tip of something whose true bulk is hidden underneath the sand. If the cut-down version of the story is right, then the part you can see is not the original mountain, it is the broken root, the thing left behind after the trunk was taken away. And if you stand in the right place, in the right light, you can almost see where the cut would have been, the line where the slope of the original peak would have continued upward into a height that no longer exists. The Anangu people will tell you, very quietly, very carefully, only when they decide that you are listening properly, that Uluru is the body of an ancestor, that the lines and pits and caves on its surface are wounds from a battle that happened in a time before time, that the rock remembers. They do not say it was cut down, they do not need to. The shape says it, the flatness on top says it, the vertical walls say it. And the way the earth around the rock falls away in every direction, perfectly level, as if everything else has been brushed aside, says it loudest of all. Some nights, when the wind is right, people who have camped in the valley swear that they can hear the rock humming, a low, deep note just at the edge of hearing, the way a bell hums for a long time after it has been struck. And maybe that is just the wind moving through the gullies on the south face. Or maybe the rock really does remember. Either way, it sits there, in the center of the continent, far older than every story that anyone has ever told about it, and it waits, very patiently, for the rest of us to catch up. Number 2, Kata Tjuta. About 30 kilometers west of Uluru, on the same plain, sharing the same impossible flatness of the land around them, sits a second formation. Most foreigners have never heard of it. The few who have heard of it know it by its old colonial name, the Olgas, named in 1872 by the explorer Ernest Giles after Queen Olga of Württemberg. The traditional name, the name the Anangu have always used, is Kata Tjuta, which means, in the Pijanjajara language, many heads. It is a cluster of 36 enormous rounded domes of red rock, rising abruptly from the desert floor like a herd of sleeping animals, or like a city of stone helmets, or like the knuckles of a great hand that has just emerged from the sand. The tallest of them, Mount Olga itself, is taller than Uluru, 546 meters above the plain. And yet, somehow, despite being larger and more numerous and arguably more strange than its famous neighbor, Kata Tjuta receives only a fraction of the visitors. Most tourists drive out to see Uluru, take their photograph, and then drive home, never realizing that the more genuinely puzzling formation is sitting just over the next horizon, watching them leave. The official explanation for Kata Tjuta is similar to the one for Uluru, but with a small and important difference. While Uluru is made of Arkose sandstone, Kata Tjuta is made of conglomerate. Conglomerate is a strange rock. It is what you get when sand and gravel and pebbles, sometimes pebbles the size of footballs, all get cemented together by the slow seeping of mineralized water through the spaces between them. The result, when you see it up close, looks almost like rough concrete. You can see the individual stones embedded in the matrix. You can put your hand on the wall of one of the domes and feel, with your fingertips, the round shapes of pebbles that fell into a riverbed 500 million years ago. The textbook says that this conglomerate accumulated in an alluvial fan, a great spreading delta of debris washing out from a long-gone mountain range, and that over time the same lifting and tilting and eroding processes that shaped Uluru also shaped Kata Tjuta. And again, you cannot really argue with that because there are no eyewitnesses left. But again, when you actually walk into the place, the textbook story develops a kind of softness around the edges. It loses its grip on the world. Because the domes are too round, they are too separate. There are valleys between them, deep, narrow, perfectly straight valleys, that look less like the work of erosion and more like the spaces between things that were once arranged. The most famous of these valleys is called the Valley of the Winds. You walk into it on a hot afternoon and the air pressure changes, the temperature drops. The sound of your own footsteps comes back to you off the walls in a way that feels almost engineered, the way a corridor in a stone building returns the sound of your shoes. Above you, the domes rise on both sides, hundreds of meters of solid, dark red rock, and you have the strangest feeling that you are not walking through a natural canyon at all. You are walking down the middle of a street that has been empty for longer than your species has existed, but a street nonetheless. And if you let your eye climb the walls, if you trace the curves of the domes against the sky, you will notice something else that the textbook does not really account for. The tops of the domes are smooth, round, the way the top of a tree stump is round after the saw has gone over it, after the fibers have weathered for a few seasons. They look, in a word that no geologist would ever use, cut, as if every one of the 36 heads of Kata Tjuta was once a much taller spire, and something came along very long ago and took the height off them, trimmed them down to something more manageable. The Anangu have a long and intricate set of stories about Kata Tjuta, most of which are not for outsiders to hear. The ones that are shared, very carefully, talk about ancestral beings called the Pongalonga, who were giants and who lived among the domes, and whose presence in the rock is part of why the place is sacred. The stories do not say the domes were once taller. They do not say the heads were once towers. But the songs treat the place with a particular kind of caution, a particular kind of respect, that you do not give to a thing that simply happened. You give that kind of respect to a thing that was done, a thing that was made or unmade by a force that you would not want to wake up. If you camp near Kata Tjuta, the formation does something at sunset that Uluru also does, only more so. The light, just before the sun drops below the horizon, hits the western faces of the domes and turns them a color that has no real name. It is not red, it is not orange, it is something deeper, a bruised, vinous, glowing color, like the inside of a wound, like the heart of a fire. The shadows between the domes go almost black, and for a few minutes the entire formation looks less like a piece of geology and more like a city, a drowned city. A city that has been pushed up out of the floor of the world and left to weather. You stand there with your camera, and the camera cannot capture it. Your eyes can barely capture it. And then the sun goes down, and the color drains out of the rock, and you are left in the grey-blue of the desert dusk, with the first stars already beginning to show above the heads of the stones. Sleep, if you sleep there, comes quickly. The silence is total. There are no insects, there are no birds. The wind moves through the valleys with a long, patient sighing sound, as if the rock is breathing. And you lie in your swag, and you look up at a sky that has more stars in it than you have ever seen in your life. And you think for just a moment that the textbook explanation is not wrong exactly. It is just not the whole story. Kata Tjuta, like its sibling 30 kilometers to the east, is a place where the surface of the earth has been changed. Whether by water or wind, or by some older and more deliberate hand, you will not be able to say. You will only know that the place feels lived in. Not by people, not now, but by the memory of something that once stood much taller than what is left. Number 3, Mount Augustus, 850 kilometers north of Perth. In a part of Western Australia that almost no tourist ever visits, there is a rock that is larger than Uluru. Twice as large by some measures. It is older too, by a long way. Older than Uluru by something like 1 billion years. And yet you can ask 10 Australians about it, and at least 8 of them will have no idea what you are talking about. The locals, the very few who live in that part of the country, call it Mount Augustus. The Wajari people, who have lived around the rock for tens of thousands of years, call it Boringara. After a young boy from one of their dreaming stories who, after breaking the laws of his people, was speared and lay down in the desert and turned to stone. His body, they say, is the rock. His knee is the highest point. His head is at the southern end. The ridges along his back are the wounds from the spears. If you look at the formation from a distance, especially from the air, you can see the shape they are talking about. A long, low lying figure, a giant asleep on the desert floor. It rises 717 meters above the surrounding plain, which already puts it more than twice as tall as Uluru, and it is enormous in the other dimensions too, about 8 kilometers long, about 3 kilometers wide. The geology, when you read the survey reports, is even stranger than Uluru's. Mount Augustus is described as a monocline, which is a fancy way of saying that the entire rock is a single, gigantic bend in the Earth's crust. The layers within it are nearly horizontal at the top, and then curve down sharply at the edges, like a tablecloth that has been draped over a low piece of furniture. The rocks at the base of Augustus are some of the oldest exposed sedimentary rocks in the world, about 1.6 billion years old, give or take, which is roughly a third of the age of the planet itself. The rocks on top, the ones that form the long, flat summit ridge, are slightly younger, but still ancient by any normal standard. And the strange part, the part that makes the geologists frown into their notebooks, is that there is no obvious reason for Mount Augustus to be there. It is not on a fault line. It is not at the edge of any current tectonic boundary. It is just somehow this gigantic upturned ball of stone sitting on a flat plain with nothing around it for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. If you climb it, and people do climb it, although it takes most of a day, and the path is rough and there is no shade and the heat in summer can kill you, then the strangeness only grows. The summit is not a peak. It is a long ridge, almost a kilometer long, almost perfectly horizontal. You can walk along the top of it and feel as though you are walking along the back of an enormous sleeping animal. The wind up there is constant. The view on a clear day is endless. You can see in every direction an absolutely flat, red, empty plain, stretching all the way to the horizon. There are no other hills. There are no other peaks. There is only Augustus and the plain and the sky. And the question, which begins to settle into your mind whether you want it there or not, is this. If a mountain this size could be lifted up out of the earth here, if a 1.5 billion-year-old layer of sedimentary rock could be folded into this enormous lying figure, then where are the other mountains? Where is the rest of the range? Mountains are not solitary creatures. They come in lines, they come in clusters, they come in spines and arcs and broken belts that run for hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. But Augustus is alone. Augustus has no neighbors. There is the rock, and then there is nothing. The official answer, again, is erosion. The rest of the range, the textbook says, was once there, and it has simply worn away over the long span of time since the rocks were first lifted up. And again, you cannot quite argue with the official answer, because the timescales involved are too large to argue with. But you stand on the summit of Burringurra at sunset, and you watch the shadow of the rock stretch across the empty plain for kilometers in the long red light. And you ask yourself a question that the geologists do not really want you to ask. If erosion is the answer, then where did all that material go? Where is the dust of the missing range? Where are the sediments that should have piled up against the base of the surviving rock? The way drifted snow piles up against the side of a building. The plain around Mount Augustus is not full of sediment. It is mostly bedrock, with a thin skin of windblown sand on top. There is no enormous fan of debris. There is no buried mountain range hiding under the soil. There is simply nothing, as if the missing range was not eroded away, as if it was taken, carried off, cut down at the base, and the cuttings hauled somewhere else, leaving Burringurra behind because perhaps even the cutters knew when to stop. Because perhaps even they recognized that a body lying down on the floor of the desert with spear wounds along its back deserved to be left alone. You climb back down at dusk, slowly, picking your way over the loose stones of the path, and the light goes out of the rock above you, and the stars begin to come out one by one in a sky that is so black and so deep and so untouched by any city light that it feels almost like a sea. You lie in your tent that night, and the wind sighs across the plain, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you hear the boy of the dreaming story. You hear him breathing, very slowly, stone breathing, the breath of a continent that was once much taller than it is now. Number 4, the Bungle Bungles. In the far northeastern corner of Western Australia, in a place called the Kimberley, there is a maze of stone that, until 1983, was effectively unknown to the outside world. The local people, the Kija and the Jaru, had known about it forever. They had lived in its valleys, hunted along its creeks, painted on the walls of its caves, and named every rock and every gully according to the dreaming stories that ran through the country like an underground river. But to the rest of the world, the place did not really exist until a film crew, working on a documentary about Western Australia, happened to fly a small plane over the area and looked down and saw something they could not quite believe. A field of striped beehive-shaped towers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, rising out of the red dirt of the Kimberley like a city of giant banded eggs. The pilot, who had flown over the area many times before, had never noticed them, because from any direction other than directly above, the towers blend into the surrounding rock. You only see them when you are looking straight down. The film crew called the place the Bungle Bungles, after a station that operated nearby. The traditional name is Uluru. The towers are made of sandstone, about 350 million years old, and they have been sculpted by erosion into rounded, dome shapes that look exactly, and there is no other word for it, like beehives. They are striped in horizontal bands of orange and grey-black. The orange bands are oxidized iron in the rock. The grey-black bands are layers of cyanobacteria, single-celled organisms that live on the surface of the stone and protect the softer, more crumbly sandstone underneath. The combination of the colours and the rounded geometry of the towers and the way they cluster together in great fields gives the entire place an appearance that is almost architectural, as if you are not standing in a natural formation at all, as if you are standing in the ruins of an enormous city, abandoned so long ago that the buildings have been weathered into smooth banded mounds, but still arranged in the rough grid of the streets that once ran between them. The Kidra people will tell you that the towers are sacred, that the stripes are the body markings of ancestral beings, painted on the stone in the time when the world was still soft and the rocks could still take the marks of bodies. They will not tell you, because it is not their way to tell, that the towers were once cut down from something taller. But the geometry of the place suggests it, the flatness of the ground between the towers, the straightness of the gorges, the way the spaces between the buildings, if you allow yourself to call them buildings, are sized for some traffic that no longer passes through. The official story again is erosion. About 20 million years ago, the textbook says, the entire region was uplifted as part of a much broader tectonic event, and the sandstone of what is now the Bungle Bungles was exposed to weathering. Over time, water flowing through the cracks in the rock cut deep narrow gorges, and the spaces between the gorges became the towers. And again, you cannot really argue with that because there are no eyewitnesses. But there is a problem. The problem is that the towers are too uniform. They are too regularly spaced. The valleys between them are too straight and too clean and too consistent in their width. If water had cut these gorges, you would expect the gorges to wander, to branch, to follow the lines of weakness in the rock. But the Bungle Bungles do not really wander. They are arranged. The towers stand in rough rows. The gorges between them run, more often than not, in straight lines that intersect at sharp angles. From the air, the place does not look like a piece of natural landscape. It looks like a plan, like the foundations of a city, viewed from above, after the buildings have collapsed and the rubble has been weathered away, leaving only the outlines of the streets. If you walk in among the towers, on one of the few paths that the ranges will allow you to use, the impression only deepens. The ground between the towers is smooth, hard, almost paved. The walls of the towers, where they face the path, are vertical and pitted with small caves. Some of the caves contain ochre paintings, hand stencils mostly, made by people who came here to shelter perhaps from the thunderstorms that roll across the Kimberley in the wet season, or perhaps from something else. The hand stencils are arranged in clusters, dozens of them, hundreds of them in some places, all printed against the rock by the same simple process. A person presses their palm against the stone. Another person fills their mouth with ochre and water and sprays the mixture across the back of the first person's hand. And when the hand is taken away, the silhouette of the hand remains on the wall, forever. Or for as close to forever as anything in this country gets. Some of the hands in the Bungle Bungles are, by carbon dating, more than 20,000 years old. Some are children's hands, some are clearly the hands of elders, knotted and missing fingers. They are the only signature that any human being has left on the place in 20,000 years of continuous occupation. They are the only way that anyone has ever said, of these towers, of these gorges, I was here. I saw this, I am part of this story. And what they do not say, what the hands cannot tell you, is whether the people who made them ever looked up at the towers and wondered, as you might be wondering now, whether the towers were always this height, whether the stripes once ran higher up, whether the city, if it was a city, was once tall enough to cast a shadow that fell across the next horizon. The towers stand there in the heat, very still, very banded, very patient. The wind moves between them with the same long, sighing sound that you heard at Kata Tjuta. The sun sets, and the orange in the stripes deepens, and the grey-black in the stripes goes almost violet. And for a few minutes, the whole place seems to glow from inside. And then night falls, and the towers become silhouettes against the stars, and the silence settles in. Sleep in the Bungle Bungles is heavy, dreamless. The stone is older than your dreams. The stone has been waiting longer than your kind has known how to wait. And whatever it is hiding, if it is hiding anything, it is not in any hurry to tell. Number 5. Mount Connor. If you drive east from Uluru on a long, lonely, almost empty road, you will eventually see on the southern horizon a dark, flat shape that, at first glance, looks exactly like Uluru. So similar, in fact, that there is a name for the trick of light and distance that makes tourists pull their cars over and reach for their cameras, certain that they are looking at the famous rock. They call it Uluru. The shape they are seeing, the shape that lies 60 kilometers south of Lake Amadeus, on the edge of the Curtin Springs cattle station, is Mount Connor. Or in the language of the Yankuni people who have lived in its shadow for as long as anyone can remember, Attila. It is not Uluru. It is, in some ways, stranger, where Uluru is a rounded, sloping monolith. Mount Connor is something different. Mount Connor is a mesa, a flat-top formation, 300 meters high, stretching for about 3 kilometers in a long, level, almost perfectly horizontal line. From the side, it looks like an enormous slab of rock that has been laid down on the desert floor and forgotten about. The top is flat. not approximately flat. Flat as the surface of a table that has been carefully leveled with a spirit level. The walls fall away from the edge of that flat top in steep cliffs. 200 meters of vertical stone before disappearing into a long, gentle apron of scree and rubble that runs all the way down to the desert. If you photograph it from the air, the formation looks unmistakably like an enormous weathered foundation, like the base of something that was once much, much taller and has since been removed from above. The kind of thing you might see in another part of the world, where an ancient temple complex has fallen into ruin and only the great stone platform underneath remains, scoured by centuries of wind, slowly losing its sharp edges to the patient work of the weather. The geology, when you read it, is interesting. The rock at the top of Mount Connor is an extremely tough, silica-rich quartzite, about 700 million years old. Beneath that, layer by layer, are progressively softer, older sedimentary rocks. The official story is that this hard cap of quartzite has protected the softer rocks underneath from erosion, the way an umbrella protects whatever is sitting on the ground beneath it. Over hundreds of millions of years, the wind and the rain have slowly worn away the surrounding country, while the umbrella has held firm, and what remains is the mesa, the classic erosional remnant, the textbook example. And again, you cannot really argue with the explanation, because the timescales involved are too vast for any single human life to test against. But again, when you stand at the base of Attila and you look up, you cannot quite shake the feeling that the explanation is reaching, that it is doing too much work. Because the apron of scree and rubble at the base of the mesa, the slope of broken stone that runs down to the desert, is small. It is shallow. It is in no way large enough to account for the kilometers of rock that the textbook insists must have once stood above where you are currently standing. If hundreds of millions of years of rain had really worn away an entire mountain, you would expect the debris of that mountain to be lying around your feet. You would expect a fan of rubble extending for kilometers in every direction, slowly being colonized by spinifex and desert oaks. But that is not what you see. You see a clean mesa, you see a flat plain. You see, in some places, neat lines where the desert sand simply runs up against the stone wall of the formation and stops, the way water stops at the side of a swimming pool, as if the surrounding land had been swept clean, as if whatever did the cutting also took the cuttings away with it. The Yankunytjatjara people will tell you, in the few stories that have been shared with outsiders, that Attila is the home of the Icemen, the Ningarki, beings who live inside the rock, who come out at night to make the cold winds that sweep across the desert in the southern winter. They will tell you that Attila is a place to be respected, approached carefully, not climbed without permission. They will not tell you, because it is not their way to make claims about the deep past, that the mesa was once taller, or that something cut it down. But they will say, with a particular kind of seriousness, that Attila is older than the desert around it, that it remembers a country that is no longer there. And when you sit at the edge of the visitor lookout on the road, in the long red light of late afternoon, and you watch the shadow of the mesa stretch slowly across the empty plain, you feel in a way that you cannot quite put into words that the lookout itself is wrong, that the height you're looking at is not the original height, that somewhere up above your line of sight, in the empty air where the rest of the rock should be, a shape is missing. Number 6, the Flinders Ranges, in the dry, brown, beautiful interior of South Australia, about 400 kilometres north of Adelaide. The Earth does something that does not really happen anywhere else on the continent. It rises into a range of mountains that go on, ridge after ridge after ridge, for more than 400 kilometres of folded, broken, ancient country. The Flinders Ranges, named, like so much of Australia, after a European explorer, in this case Matthew Flinders, who did not actually explore them. To the Adnyamathanha people, the people of the rock, who have lived in the gorges and on the slopes of the range for at least 40,000 years, the place has a different name, or rather, it has many different names, because the Flinders are not a single thing. They are a long, complicated, layered country, full of separate hills and valleys and rock shelters, each with its own name, its own story, its own ancestor. But there is one feature near the center of the range that gathers all the strangeness of the entire country into a single shape. It is called Wilpena Pound. A pound, in Australian English, is a fenced enclosure, a place where you keep livestock that has been rounded up. The early colonists called this place Wilpena Pound because when they first saw it, it looked to them like a vast natural enclosure, ringed by mountains with one narrow opening at the southern end. The reality, when you actually fly over it, or hike up to one of the ridgetop viewpoints and look down, is something stranger and more imposing than the colonial name suggests. Wilpena Pound is an enormous oval-shaped basin, about 17 kilometers long and 7 kilometers wide, surrounded on all sides by a continuous wall of rock that rises, in places, more than 500 meters above the floor of the basin. The walls are made of an extremely tough quartzite, about 540 million years old, called the Pound Quartzite. They form an almost unbroken ring. Seen from above, the formation looks, more than anything else in the world, like the rim of a colossal crater. A crater so old that the floor of it has been weathered into rolling hills, dotted with red gum trees and creeks. A crater so deeply embedded in the country that, when you stand inside it and look up at the walls on every side, you cannot quite believe that this is the result of ordinary erosion. The official explanation, of course, says that it is. The geologists call Wilpena Pound a synclinal basin, which is the term for what happens when a layer of rock is pressed downward into a long, scoop-shaped depression by tectonic forces, and the surrounding, more sharply uplifted rock is then eroded away, leaving the bottom of the scoop behind. The harder pound quartzite, in this scenario, has resisted erosion better than the softer rocks around it, and so it has formed a high ring around the basin, while the center, made of more easily weathered material, has been worn down into the rolling country you see today. It is, the geologists insist, a perfectly normal piece of geology. There are similar synclinal basins in other parts of the world. There is no need to invoke any unusual process. And yet, when you walk through the gap at the southern end of the pound, on the path that leads in toward the old homestead, and you stand on the floor of the basin, with the great ring of cliffs surrounding you on every side, the explanation feels strangely thin. The shape is so regular. The ring is so continuous. The floor of the basin slopes inward toward a single low point. The whole place feels, in a way that no textbook will admit to, designed. The Adnyamathanha people have a story about Wilpena Pound. They say that two enormous serpents, the Akura, came from the north during the dreaming, and they wound their way down through the country, eating everything in their path until they came to the place that is now the pound. And they coiled around it, and their bodies hardened into stone, and the walls of the basin are their backs. The story does not say that the pound was made by something falling from the sky. It does not say that the basin is a wound, but the story does treat the place, very clearly, as the result of something that was done, by something living in a time before time, as an event, as an act, not as the slow, patient working of weather and water over hundreds of millions of years, but as a moment, a single great moment, when something came down out of the country and took a shape that the country has held ever since. You camp inside the pound on a night when the moon is full, and you can almost imagine it. The silver light pouring over the rim, the walls all around you, dark and dreaming. The sound of a creek running somewhere through the hills, very faint, very steady. You lie in your swag and you look up at the sky and you think, just for a moment, that you're at the bottom of an enormous ancient bowl. Something has been here. Something has done something to this country, and the country has not yet finished telling the story. Number 7, the Glass House Mountains. About 60 kilometres north of Brisbane, on the Sunshine Coast hinterland, the rolling green farmland of southeastern Queensland is suddenly and dramatically interrupted. From the surrounding country, which is gentle and pastoral and dotted with cattle, a series of strange, isolated peaks rise abruptly into the air. They are not connected to one another. They do not form a range or a ridge or a continuous chain. They simply stand, scattered across the landscape, each one separate, each one with its own distinctive shape. There are 11 of them, more or less, depending on how you count the smaller ones. Some are sharp, conical spires, almost like volcanic cones in a children's drawing. Others are more rounded, more dome-shaped, like enormous helmets dropped on the grass. The tallest, called Mount Beerwah, rises 556 meters above the surrounding plain. The most photographed, called Mount Cunoran, is a sharp, leaning pillar of stone that, if you saw it on a movie poster, you would assume was an artist's exaggeration. It is not. It is exactly that shape, in real life, in the middle of a green, rolling, otherwise unremarkable countryside. Captain James Cook, when he sailed up the eastern coast of Australia in 1770, saw the peaks from his ship, and he wrote in his journal that they reminded him of the glass houses of his native Yorkshire, the bottle-shaped chimneys sticking up out of the surrounding country, in which molten glass was made and worked. He named the formation the Glass House Mountains. The Gubbi people, who had been living among them for many thousands of years, had their own names for each peak. Beerwah, the largest, is the mother. Tibrogargan is the father. Cunoran is one of their children. The story they tell is that Cunoran, in a moment of cowardice, refused to help his pregnant mother to high ground when a great flood was coming, and his father, in his shame and rage, struck him so hard that his neck was broken. And that is why the peak still leans all these long ages later, with a permanently bent neck. It is one of the oldest stories in the country, and it is, like so many of the oldest stories, a story about a wound, a story about a moment of violence, a story about something that was done to the rock. The official explanation for the Glasshouse Mountains is that they are volcanic plugs. About 26 million years ago, the textbook says, this part of southeastern Queensland was a region of intense volcanic activity. Magma rose through the Earth's crust along a series of vertical conduits. In some places, the magma reached the surface and erupted as lava. In other places, it cooled and hardened inside the conduits themselves, forming hard, resistant cores of igneous rock. Over the next 20 million years, the surrounding softer rock was eroded away, exposing these hard cores, which now stand as the Glasshouse Mountains. The peaks, the textbook insists, are not the volcanoes themselves. They are the throats of the volcanoes, the plumbing, the internal stems left behind after the rest of the structure has weathered away. And again, you cannot really argue with the explanation. There are similar volcanic plugs in other parts of the world. The geology is well understood. The radiometric dating of the rocks supports the story. The textbook is, in this case, almost certainly correct. And yet, when you stand at the base of one of the peaks and you look up at the sheer, vertical, almost geometrical shape of it, you cannot quite escape a different feeling. The feeling that you are standing at the foot of something that was once much, much taller. The feeling that what you are looking at is the lower section of something whose upper section has been removed. Because if the Glasshouse Mountains really are the cause of volcanoes, then the surrounding land must once have been hundreds of meters higher than it is now. The volcanic cones themselves, the ash and lava and rubble that built up around the hard plugs, would have stood far above where you are currently standing. The mountains, in their original form, would have been much, much larger, and all of that material is now somehow gone. The plain around the Glasshouse Mountains is not full of ancient volcanic debris. It is mostly sedimentary rock and rich, dark agricultural soil, and the occasional outcrop of basalt. There is no enormous sloping fan of ancient ash and rubble surrounding each peak, the way you would expect from a normal eroding volcano. The peaks stand isolated, sharp, almost as if they had been cut out of a much larger structure, and the rest of the structure had been carried away. The Gubby Gubby story does not say that the mountains were once bigger. The story says they were people, a family, frozen in stone in a moment of pain by a forgotten kind of sorrow. And maybe that is the more honest version. Maybe the mountains are not the throats of volcanoes at all. Maybe they are the remaining pieces of a family that, for reasons no one will ever know, was struck and broken and left behind, with their mother and their father and their bent-necked son, all standing there on the green plains of southeastern Queensland, watching the cars go past on the highway, watching the small white houses of the farms, watching the centuries roll past them, very slowly, very patiently, the way rocks do. Number 8. The MacDonnell Ranges. The MacDonnell Ranges are not famous in the way that Uluru is famous. They are not on the postcards. They are not on the cover of the tourism brochures. But if you fly over the centre of Australia on a clear day, and you look out the window of the plane at the country below, you will see them, and the shape of them will stay with you for a long time. The MacDonnell Ranges are a series of long, narrow, almost perfectly parallel ridges of red rock, running east to west across the Northern Territory for a distance of more than 640 kilometres. 640. From a point near the Western Australian border, all the way through to the country east of Alice Springs. They are not a single mountain range in the way that the Rocky Mountains are a single range, or the Andes. They are a series of ridges side by side running parallel to one another, with long narrow valleys in between. Seen from above, the country looks as if a giant, very tidy gardener has gone through it with a rake, leaving long, regular, evenly spaced furrows. The ridges all run in the same direction. The valleys between them are all about the same width. The whole formation has a kind of disciplined, patterned quality that does not really fit the way you expect a mountain range to look. The Arrernte people, the traditional owners of this country, have an enormous and complex set of stories about the MacDonnell Ranges. They are, in the Arrernte cosmology, the bodies of caterpillars, great ancestral caterpillars called the Yeperenia, which moved across the country in the Dreamtime, eating their way through the land, and which eventually, when their work was finished, lay down on the desert floor and turned to stone. The ridges of the ranges are the bodies of the caterpillars. The gaps in the ranges, the famous gorges where the rivers cut through, are the spaces between one caterpillar and the next, or the wounds in the caterpillars where their enemies bit them. There are several of these gaps, and they are some of the most spectacular places in Central Australia. Stanley Chasm, Simpsons Gap, Ormiston Gorge, Glen Helen. Each one is a vertical-sided slot, cut through the red rock of the range, with a creek running along the bottom and walls rising hundreds of meters on either side. Each one feels, when you walk into it, less like a natural feature and more like a cut. A clean, deliberate cut made by something that was very, very large, and that knew exactly what it was doing. The official explanation for the parallelism of the ridges has to do with very old folding events in the Earth's crust. The rocks of the MacDonnell Ranges were laid down as sediments hundreds of millions of years ago, and were then folded into a series of parallel anticlines and synclines by a continental collision around 350 million years ago. After the folding, the textbook says, the country was eroded for hundreds of millions of years, and the harder layers of rock, the ones that resisted erosion better, were left standing as the ridges, while the softer layers were worn away into the valleys. It is a perfectly standard geological story, and the dates and the rock types and the structural evidence all support it. But again, when you actually stand at the entrance of one of the gorges and you look up at the impossibly straight, impossibly parallel walls, the standard story feels somehow undersized, inadequate, as if it explains the broad outline of the place but not the specific details. Why are the ridges so straight? Why are the valleys between them so uniform in width? Why do the gorges where the creeks cut through run perpendicular to the ridges with such precision? Why does the whole formation look, from the air, as if it has been measured? The ancestral caterpillar story does not answer these questions exactly. It does not have to. It is not a scientific theory. It is a way of saying in the patient language of country that the place was made, that it was put here in this exact pattern for reasons that are part of the story of the world, that the lines of the ridges, the spacing of the valleys, the cleanness of the cuts where the gorges run through are not accidental. They are part of a song that has been sung through the country for longer than any other song in the world. And when you walk into Stanley Chasm in the late afternoon, and the sun is at exactly the right angle to throw the western wall into a deep, bloody red, while the eastern wall stays in shadow, and the color of the rock is so intense that it looks almost wet, you understand? In a way that does not have any words attached to it, that the song is correct, that something happened here, that the ridges of the MacDonnells are not just ridges. They are the parallel cuts of a much larger structure that has, somehow, somewhere along the way, been removed. Number 9. Karlu Karlu, about 100 kilometers south of Tennant Creek on the Stuart Highway, in a part of the Northern Territory that most travelers pass through without really stopping. There is a field of stones that looks to a tired driver pulling over for a break, almost like a joke, like a prank that the country has decided to play on the engineers who built the road. The stones are enormous. They are perfectly, almost ridiculously round. They are made of red granite. They are scattered across a low, gently sloping area of the desert, in groups and pairs, and sometimes in single, lonely examples, with no particular pattern that anyone has been able to identify. Some of them are the size of a small car. Some of them are the size of a house. Some of them are split clean down the middle, as if they have been cut in half by an enormous knife, with the two halves still standing side by side, at exactly the angle they were in when the cut was made. The official name on the signs that the Park Service has erected for the tourists is the Devil's Marbles. The traditional name, the name that the Warramungu and Kaititie and Aluwara and Walpiri people, all of whom share custodianship of the place, have always used is Karlu Karlu, which means more or less round boulders, a practical name, a name that gets the point across. The official explanation is geological in the most ordinary way. Around 1.5 billion years ago, a great body of granite cooled deep beneath the surface of the earth. As the granite cooled, it cracked in a pattern of vertical and horizontal joints. Over the following billion or so years, the country above the granite was slowly eroded away, exposing the granite to the air. Once exposed, the granite began to weather, in a process called spheroidal weathering, where water and chemical change attacked the corners and edges of the cracked blocks more aggressively than the centers, slowly rounding off the blocks until they become spheres. The blocks at the bottom of each pile, where the water collected and worked the longest, were rounded the most. The blocks at the top, more recently exposed, are still relatively angular. And so, over hundreds of millions of years, the textbook says, you end up with a field of granite spheres, sitting on top of a granite platform, in a landscape that has been gradually lowered around them. It is, in the way that a great deal of Australian geology is, a perfectly reasonable story. It is taught in every undergraduate course in the country, and it accounts for many of the features of the place. But it does not, when you are actually standing there, account for everything, because the stones at Karlu Karlu are not arranged the way you would expect from a process of pure erosion. They are not all sitting on a flat surface. Some of them are perched, balanced on top of other stones, in arrangements that look, from a distance, almost playful, as if a child had spent the afternoon stacking pebbles in a creek. 2 stones balanced on each other in a way that seems impossible. 3 stones leaning against one another, forming a rough triangle. A single, enormous, perfectly spherical stone sitting on top of a much smaller stone, in a contact zone so small that you cannot quite believe the larger stone has not rolled off in the 800 or 900 million years since it was put there. The textbook explanation handles all of this, of course. The textbook explanation can handle anything. The textbook says that the upper stones are simply the more resistant remnants of larger blocks, balanced on what is left of the lower blocks after most of them have eroded away. And again, you cannot quite argue with the textbook because the timescales are too vast and the process is too slow for any human observation to test against. But you stand there in the late afternoon with the sun starting to drop toward the horizon and the stones beginning to glow a deep, almost violet red, and you cannot quite shake the impression that the field of boulders looks less like a piece of natural geology and more like a sculpture garden, a garden of round stones, placed there, deliberately, by something whose hands could lift granite the size of a small house. The Warramungu people will tell you, very carefully, that Karlu Karlu is a place of the rainbow serpent. that the boulders are the eggs of the serpent, laid here in the dream time, when the country was still being made. They will tell you that to disturb the stones is to wake something that is much better off left to sleep, that the round shapes of the boulders, and the way the boulders are split open in places to reveal pale, smooth interiors, are not accidents. They are the leftover signs of a great event, a moment when the world was changed and the eggs of the serpent were laid down in the desert and turned to stone. They will not tell you, because it is not their place to tell, that the stones are perhaps the remains of something that was carved or quarried or worked. But they will say with a particular kind of certainty that the place is alive, that the stones know you are there, that the stones, if you sleep among them on a still cold desert night, will speak to you in your dreams. And maybe they do. Maybe what you're hearing in the small hours when the wind has died and the country is so quiet that you can hear the blood in your own ears is just the cooling of the rock, the slow contraction of granite that has been baked all day in the sun, ticking and creaking as it adjusts to the change in temperature. Or maybe it is something older, some old, slow conversation in a language that has no words between the eggs of a serpent that was laid here so long ago that the very meaning of the word here has changed several times since. Number 10. The Pinnacles, about 200 kilometres north of Perth, on the western coast of Australia. There is a stretch of country that, until you walk into it, looks like the most ordinary kind of dune system. Yellow sand, low scrubby coastal vegetation, the smell of the sea just over the rise. You park your car in the small visitor lot at the entrance to the Nambung National Park, and you walk over the first dune, and then you stop because what you are looking at on the other side of the dune is not a beach. It is not a dune field. It is a forest of stone. Thousands of vertical, weathered, jagged columns of limestone sticking up out of the yellow sand in a gentle slope that runs all the way to the next ridge, where the columns continue and continue and continue for kilometers in every direction. Some of the columns are tiny, only ankle high. Others are taller than you, 4, 5, 6 meters of pitted, irregular, soft yellow stone. They stand close together, in some places only a few meters apart, in other places 10 or 15 meters apart, with the smooth yellow sand visible between them. The whole place feels, when you walk into it, like the petrified remains of a forest, like a place where every tree has been turned to stone, and the trees themselves are now slowly being weathered down by the wind and the salt air, into shapes that are neither tree nor rock, but something in between. The pinnacles, as they are called, are made of soft, porous limestone. The official explanation says that they formed somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 years ago, by a process that involves seashells. The story goes that the dunes of this part of the coast were once made of sand that contained a high proportion of crushed seashell, which is calcium carbonate, the same compound that limestone is made from. As rainwater percolated down through the dunes, it dissolved some of the calcium carbonate and then redeposited it lower down, where it cemented some of the sand grains together into hard, irregular masses. Over time, the original dunes were stabilized by vegetation, and then, when the climate changed and the vegetation died back, the loose sand on top was blown away by the wind, exposing the harder, cemented columns underneath. The columns in this story are essentially fossilized root systems, or more precisely, the remnants of the cemented zones around the roots of long-dead plants, where the calcium carbonate accumulated more aggressively because of the chemical activity of the roots themselves. It is a clever explanation. It accounts for many of the features of the place. And it is, like most of the textbook explanations we have looked at so far, very probably correct in its broad outlines. But again, when you walk into the pinnacles, the textbook story does not quite fit the way the place feels. The columns are too uniform in their height in some areas. They are too closely spaced. The forest analogy that everyone reaches for when they first see the place is too strong to dismiss. The place feels, very strongly, like the petrified remains of something that was once alive and growing and standing upright, and that has since been turned to stone and then half buried in sand. And the local stories, the stories of the Yuad people, who have known about the pinnacles for many thousands of years, are interesting in the way that local stories so often are. The Yuad have not traditionally gone into the pinnacles area very often. They have considered it a strange place. A place where the sand is alive, a place where the bones of the country come up out of the dunes, and where you do not stay long after dark because the columns, they say, can sometimes move. They can sometimes shift their positions by very small amounts from one full moon to the next. And while the geologists will laugh gently at the suggestion of moving stones, the visitors who have spent the night in the pinnacles, on the rare occasions when permission is granted, will tell you that there are sounds. The wind through the columns has a voice, a high, wandering, almost musical voice, as if the forest of stone is whistling to itself, very quietly, in a tune that the wind alone could not be expected to produce. You walk among them in the early morning, before the first tour bus arrives, and the long slanting light of the sun lays down sharp shadows behind every column, and you have the unsettling feeling that you are walking through the ruins of something, not a forest after all. A village, a small stone village in which all the inhabitants have, very long ago, been turned to stone and are now standing very still, watching you walk past. There are pillars that look, from a certain angle, almost human. Tall, narrow, with a slight bulge at the top that could be a head, and another bulge below it that could be shoulders. There are clusters of pillars that look like family groups, mothers, fathers, children, all standing close together, all of them stone. The textbook will tell you, patiently, that this is pareidolia, the mind's tendency to see human shapes where none exist, and the textbook is, of course, correct. There are no human shapes in the pinnacles. There are only columns of cemented limestone, weathered into irregular forms by the wind. But still, when the morning fog rolls in off the ocean, and the columns appear and disappear in the white drifting cloud, and you can hear nothing but your own footsteps on the sand, and the very faint, very high voice of the wind, you would not want to be the one to argue with the Yurt. Number 11, Wollongben. In the far northeastern corner of New South Wales, very close to the Queensland border, there is a mountain that, to the untrained eye, looks like a single sharp peak rising abruptly out of the surrounding green country. It is the first place on the entire eastern coast of Australia to catch the light of the rising sun each morning, before any other part of the continent. It is 1,157 metres above sea level. Captain James Cook, again, was the first European to give it a name. He saw it from his ship in 1770, after a difficult and dangerous passage past a series of treacherous reefs, and he named it Mount Warning, because for him it was the warning sign that those reefs were close. The traditional name, the name that the Bunjalung people have always used, is Wollongben, which is sometimes translated as Cloudcatcher, and sometimes as Fighting Chief of the Mountains, and sometimes by other words again, because the name is layered and contains more meaning than any single English word can hold. What is undeniable when you know what you're looking at is that Wollongben is not really a mountain in the way that the casual visitor assumes. Wollongben is a piece of something much larger. The central plug of a very ancient, very large shield volcano, whose entire outer structure has, in some way, been removed. The geology, when you read it, is some of the most striking in Australia. About 23 million years ago, the country around Wollongben was the site of an enormous volcano. Not a small, neat, conical volcano of the kind you see in cartoons. A shield volcano, broad and flat and gentle sloped, perhaps as much as 100 kilometers across at its base, and rising perhaps 2,000 meters above the surrounding country at its peak. It erupted for a long time. Lava flowed out of it in great sheets. Ash and rubble built up on its slopes. And then, eventually, the volcano went quiet. The magma chamber cooled, and in the long, slow, patient time that followed, the entire enormous structure was, the textbook says, eroded away, carved off, reduced. Today, what is left is the central plug, the hard core of the volcano, sticking up out of an enormous ring-shaped depression that the geologists call the Tweed caldera. The Tweed caldera is one of the largest erosion calderas anywhere on the planet. It is about 40 kilometers across. Its rim is formed by the remnants of the original outer slopes of the volcano, which now appear, on the modern map, as a series of separate ranges, the McPherson Range, the Tweed Range, the Border Ranges, all of them following the curve of the original volcano's edge. From the air, when the morning sun is at the right angle, you can see the ring perfectly. A great green circle of mountains with Wollongben standing in the center, like the lonely tower in the middle of an abandoned fortress. And here again is where the textbook explanation begins to ask a great deal of the listener. Because if the volcano really was as large as the geologists describe, and if the entire outer structure really did erode away over the past 20 million years, then the volume of rock that has been removed from this part of the country is staggering. Hundreds of cubic kilometers of basalt and ash, all of it carried away by the rivers, the rains, the slow, patient hand of time. Where did it go? The textbook says it was carried eventually out to sea, down the rivers, into the Tasman, spread across the continental shelf. And maybe that is true. The continental shelf does, in fact, contain a great deal of sediment, and some of it must have come from somewhere. But still, when you stand on the summit of Wollongben at sunrise, with the green hills of the caldera rim spread out around you in every direction, and you try to imagine the original volcano towering up over your head, twice as tall as the highest peak of the modern range, you can only do it for a few seconds before the imagination falls back. The scale is too large. The amount of removed material is too great. And the way Wollongben itself sits, perfectly central, perfectly upright, with sharp, almost geometric sides, looks less like the eroded core of a vanished volcano and more like the central column of an enormous structure whose outer walls have somehow been taken down. The Bunjalung people will tell you, in the stories they share with outsiders, that Wollongben is the body of an ancestor warrior, slain in a great battle, and that the mountain holds the memory of his strength. They will tell you that the place is sacred, that only certain people, after long preparation, are permitted to climb to the summit. They will tell you that the morning light, which strikes Wollongben first of all the eastern places, is a gift from the warrior to the country, They will not tell you, because they do not need to, that the surrounding ring of green hills was once joined together into a single great structure that towered over the warrior's body. The shape of the country says it. The ring of mountains, perfectly arranged around the central peak, says it. And on a clear morning, when you stand on the rim of the caldera and look across the Great Green Basin to where Wollongong rises out of the cloud, you can almost feel the height of the missing structure, the empty air above your head, where 2,000 meters of additional mountain ought to be standing. Number 12, the Blue Mountains. A short drive west of Sydney, on a road that climbs steadily up out of the coastal plain, the country opens out into one of the most photographed landscapes in Australia. The Blue Mountains. Although, as visitors quickly learn, the Blue Mountains are not really mountains at all, not in the conventional sense. They are a high, dissected plateau cut by an extraordinary network of deep, sheer-walled valleys, and the experience of walking out onto one of the lookouts at Echo Point, or Govetts Leap, or the Three Sisters, is not the experience of standing on a peak and looking down at the country below. It is the experience of standing on the edge of a great green chasm, with the floor of the valley spread out far beneath your feet, and another flat-topped escarpment rising on the opposite side, and beyond that another and another, in receding lines all the way to the horizon. The Blue Mountains, despite their name, are flat on top. They are an enormous level surface, sitting at about 1,000 meters above sea level, into which great rivers have carved valleys hundreds of meters deep, leaving behind a pattern of mazes and pinnacles and isolated stone towers that, when you look at them honestly, do not look like mountains at all. They look like the foundations of something, the remaining base of a much larger landform that has been cut off at a uniform height. The official explanation comes in two parts. The first part is about how the plateau was formed. The rocks of the Blue Mountains are mostly Triassic sandstone, deposited in a series of vast river deltas about 250 million years ago, when this part of the world was a low-lying coastal plain. Layer after layer of sand was washed in by the rivers, compressed over time into the hard, pale, beautifully cross-bedded sandstone that you see in the cliffs today. The second part of the explanation is about how the valleys were carved. About 90 million years ago, the entire region was uplifted, slowly, by tectonic forces, until it sat at its current elevation. The rivers that had been running across the surface of the plain at sea level continued to flow, and as the country rose around them, they kept on cutting downward, the way a saw keeps cutting through a piece of wood that is being slowly raised against it. Over the next 90 million years, the rivers cut deeper and deeper into the rising sandstone until they had carved out the spectacular network of gorges and valleys that defines the modern landscape. It is, again, a coherent story. It explains the orientation of the valleys, the layered structure of the cliffs, the gradient of the streams, and a great many of the details that you see when you look at the country with a geologist's eye. And it is, again, almost certainly correct in its broad outlines. There is no need to invoke any unusual mechanism for the carving of the gorges. Rivers will carve gorges, given enough time. The mountains, the textbook says, are not really mountains. They are an old plateau, half eaten away by water. The peaks you see from the lookouts are simply the remaining slivers of the plateau that have not yet been worn down. But again, when you stand at one of the lookouts and you allow yourself to actually see what is in front of you, the textbook story seems to be missing something, because the plateau is too flat. The remaining peaks, the famous Three Sisters, Mount Solitary, the ruined castle, all rise to almost exactly the same height. The escarpment on the far side of the Jameson Valley sits at the same level as the escarpment on the near side. The cliffs along the rim of every valley, no matter how isolated, no matter how widely separated, all have their tops at more or less the same elevation, as if some enormous flat surface had once existed at exactly that height, and the entire valley system had been carved downward from that surface, which is, of course, what the textbook says happened. The original plateau was flat, the valleys cut downward into it, and the remaining flat tops are the surviving fragments of the original plateau. Fair enough, but what the textbook does not quite explain is why the original plateau itself was so flat, why the entire surface, across hundreds of square kilometers of country, was apparently level to within a few meters. Plateaus, in the natural world, are not normally that flat. They have hills, they have ridges, they have variations in elevation, of tens or hundreds of meters, across distances that small. But the Blue Mountains Plateau, before the rivers got to work, must have been almost as flat as a prepared roadbed, as if the country had been planned. The Gundungurra and Darug peoples, the traditional owners of the Blue Mountains, have a long and rich set of stories about the country. The Three Sisters, those famous three pillars at Echo Point that every tour bus stops to photograph, are, in the most common version of the story, three young women who were turned to stone by a witch doctor to protect them from a great beast that was hunting them, and who never managed to be turned back to their original forms, because the witch doctor was killed before he could perform the reverse spell. The pillars stand there on the edge of the cliff, three tall, narrow towers of weathered sandstone, with the wind moving very slowly across their tops, and the morning mist drifting in and out of the valley below, and the late afternoon light turning their pale stone the color of warm honey. The story is, in its way, exactly the kind of story that a place like that demands. Three things of equal stature, side by side, on the edge of a vast drop, looking out over the country forever. The story does not say that the witch doctor cut the country down to its current level. It does not need to. The flatness of the plateau says it. The uniform height of every escarpment in every direction says it. And the way the morning light moves across the country, illuminating the tops of all the mesas at the same moment, as if a single great surface had been swept by the dawn, says it most clearly of all. You stand at Echo Point in the early morning, before the tour buses have arrived, and you watch the blue haze rise up out of the eucalyptus forests far below. The haze is the famous blue color that gives the mountains their name, the result of fine droplets of eucalyptus oil scattering the blue light from the sky. The haze fills the valleys and softens the edges of the cliffs and makes the receding escarpments look almost like sea. Like an enormous bay, with bays within bays, and headlands within headlands, all the way to the horizon. And you can almost imagine, just for a moment, that the country in front of you is not a deeply incised plateau at all. It is the floor of something. The floor of an enormous structure whose ceiling was once, very long ago, somewhere up above where you're standing, and which has somehow been taken down. You stay there, breathing the cold morning air, and the blue haze drifts up out of the valley, and the sky above is so clear that you can almost feel the missing height. The empty space above the Three Sisters, where, in another world, the rest of them might still be standing. Number 13. Wave Rock. In the wheat belt of southwestern Australia, about 340 kilometres east of Perth, on the edge of a small farming town called Hyden, there is a granite outcrop that has, for the past few decades, made it onto an unusual number of Western Australian tourism brochures. The locals call it Wave Rock, and the name, for once, is not exaggerated. The rock really does look exactly like a wave. Specifically, it looks like the kind of large, smooth, curling wave that you see in Hawaiian surfing photographs, frozen at the precise moment when the curl is about to break, with the great hollow underbelly of the wave overhanging the beach. Wave Rock is 15 meters high. It is about 110 meters long. Its lower section is straight and smooth and slightly inward leaning, like a high concave wall. Its upper section curves outward over the head of the viewer, a great rounded lip of stone that overhangs the path along the base of the rock, exactly as the curl of a wave overhangs the water beneath it. The whole formation is striped in long, vertical bands of grey and tan and rusty red, where mineralized water has run down the face of the rock for a very, very long time, leaving a pattern of stains that emphasizes the wave-like geometry. Photographs of Wave Rock have been printed on countless calendars and postcards and tourism advertisements. From the right angle, with the right lighting, the formation looks almost like a single, perfect breaking wave that has been petrified in the middle of an empty wheat field. The age of the rock is enormous. The granite of Wave Rock is, by the most recent estimates, about 2.5 to 2.7 billion years old, which is to say, more than half the age of the planet. It is part of the Yilgarn Craton, a great block of ancient continental crust that forms the geological foundation of southwestern Australia, and it is among the oldest exposed rock anywhere on the surface of the Earth. The textbook explanation for the wave shape involves a process called subsurface weathering, in which water moving through the soil at the base of a granite outcrop, before the outcrop is fully exposed to the air, attacks the bottom of the rock more aggressively than the top, slowly hollowing out a curve in the lower section. Over time, as the surrounding soil is gradually eroded away, the curved lower section is exposed, and you end up with a granite outcrop whose lower edge is concave, just as the lower edge of a breaking wave is concave. It is, in the most ordinary sense of the word, a flare, a subsurface flare. There are smaller examples of the same thing on granite outcrops all over the world. Wave Rock just happens to be one of the biggest and most photogenic examples ever found. And the textbook story, which is supported by the chemistry of the soil and by detailed studies of similar formations elsewhere, is, as in every other case we have looked at so far, very probably correct in its broad outlines. But here, again, the broad outlines do not tell the whole story, because the rock, when you stand at the base of it, and you look along the curve of the wave from one end to the other, is too perfect. The curve is too consistent. The height of the lip all the way along the formation varies by only a small amount. The vertical striping of the stains is too uniform. The rock looks, when you photograph it from a slight distance, less like a freak of subsurface weathering and more like the carefully sculpted side of an ancient retaining wall, with a generous capstone curving outward over the path, as if the outcrop were not really an outcrop at all, but the surviving lip of a great basin, or the inward edge of a vast ceremonial bowl, with most of the bowl now buried in soil, and only this one wave-shaped section still showing above the surface. The Ballardong Noongar people, who are the traditional owners of this country, tell stories about wave rock that connect it, like so many of the rocks of Australia, to the rainbow serpent, The Wargle, in their cosmology, is the great serpent who made the rivers and waterholes of southwestern Australia. The shape of wave rock, they say, is the body of the Wargle, frozen at the moment when the serpent was caught in the act of moving across the country. The wave is not really a wave. It is the side of the body of the serpent, leaning out across the path with the long vertical stripes of mineralization marking the scales. If you walk along the base of the formation with your hand trailing on the stone, you can feel the smoothness of the curve. You can feel the way the rock was shaped, not by chisels, but by something gentler, by water perhaps, by the slow rasping of fine grit carried by the wind over hundreds of millions of years, by the pressure of the soil itself before the outcrop was exposed. The textbook gives you all these explanations, and any of them might be true. But you sit on the bench at the base of the rock in the late afternoon, with the sun going down over the wheat fields behind you and the lip of the wave glowing a deep, warm red just above your head. And you can feel, in a way that the textbook does not quite admit to, that the place is older than the explanations. The granite under your hand was solid before there were animals. It was solid before there were plants. It was solid before there was an atmosphere with oxygen in it. And whatever the wave is, whatever it has been over those long ages, the wave has been waiting for the wheat fields to come, and for the small farming town to come, and for the calendars and the postcards and the tour buses to come, and for you, in your time, to come and put your hand against it, and feel the warmth of the day's sun coming back out of the stone, very slowly, very patiently, as the night settles in. Number 14. The Kimberley. In the far northwestern corner of the continent, in a region the size of Germany, there is a piece of country that almost no one ever sees. The Kimberley, a vast, ancient, raised plateau of red sandstone cut by enormous gorges and flanked by long, broken coastlines, where the tide ranges are among the largest in the world and the rivers run, in the wet season, in great brown floods, and in the dry season, dwindle to a series of clear pools strung along the bottoms of the gorges like beads on a thread. The Kimberley is one of the most remote regions of one of the most remote countries on Earth. There are no major cities. There are very few towns. Most of the country is accessible only by four-wheel drive, along corrugated dirt roads that, in the wet season, become rivers themselves, and that close, sometimes for months at a time, to all but the most determined travelers. And the country, for all its remoteness, has been continuously inhabited by Aboriginal peoples for at least 65,000 years. The Wandjina paintings of the Kimberley, those eerie figures with great round eyes and no mouths, painted on the walls of caves and rock shelters all across the region, are among the oldest religious art still in active use anywhere in the world. The Wandjina, the people of the country will tell you, are the spirits of the clouds, the makers of the storms, the givers of the wet season rains. They live in the rocks, they live in the paintings, they watch over the country. And the country, when you fly over it, is one of the strangest landscapes anywhere in the southern hemisphere. The Kimberley Plateau is a great, raised, flat-topped block of stone. It rises in places almost 1,000 meters above sea level, but it does not rise in the way that mountains rise. It rises straight up, like a low table with vertical or nearly vertical walls along most of its margins, and a flat, broad surface on top. The walls of the plateau are cut by gorges, in some places only a few meters wide, with sheer red cliffs on both sides, dropping hundreds of meters to the floor below. The Mitchell Plateau, in the far north of the region, is a particularly clear example. From the air, it looks like an enormous slab of red and gold stone that has been laid down on the surface of the earth and forgotten. Its edges are sharp, its top is flat. The waterfalls that pour off the rim in the wet season fall hundreds of meters in a single drop, with no intermediate ledges, no soft transitions, only the sharp lip of the plateau and the long white shimmering line of the falling water. The famous Mitchell Falls, the Wandjina country, the land that the people of the rock have been painting and singing about and living on for a span of time so vast that the very meaning of the word time begins when you stand on the rim of the plateau to come slightly loose from its moorings. The geological story of the Kimberley is, in some ways, even harder to swallow than the stories we have looked at so far. The rocks of the plateau are mostly sandstone, deposited in a great inland basin somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 billion years ago. They were laid down flat. They have, by the most careful measurements that have ever been made, remained nearly flat for the past 1.5 billion years. Which is to say, the plateau has been there, in something like its current configuration, for almost a third of the age of the planet. Most of the great mountain ranges of the modern world, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, the Alps, are tens of millions of years old. The Kimberley Plateau is hundreds of times older than any of them. It has watched continents drift apart. It has watched the climate change dozens of times over. It has watched extinctions and recoveries, an entire phyla of life come into being and pass away. And through all of that, the plateau has remained more or less where it is, more or less how it is, slowly weathering at its edges, slowly losing material to the rivers that cut across it, but never really being made or unmade in any dramatic way. And here, finally, is where the cut-down idea begins to make a kind of physical sense, even to the most skeptical of listeners. Because the Kimberley Plateau, with its sharp edges and its flat top and its impossibly old age, looks, from the air, less like a piece of natural geology, and more like the remaining base of something that was once much larger. The flatness of the top, after 1.5 billion years of weathering, should not be flat. It should be hilly, it should be eroded, it should have valleys and ridges and irregularities of every kind. But over much of its surface, the Kimberley is so flat that you can drive on it for hours, on a single straight track, and the country does not seem to change. The walls are too vertical, the gorges are too sharp. The whole formation has the appearance, when you study it for long enough, of a great stone platform on which something even larger was once standing, and which, after that, something was taken away, has been left to weather very slowly through the long ages of the world. The Wandjina paintings, with their round watching eyes, are some of the only signs that anything has happened in the Kimberley in the last 60,000 years. They look out from their rock walls at a country that has been quietly waiting, for nearly half the age of the Earth, for someone to come back and ask the question that no one has yet been brave enough to ask. Number 15. Cradle Mountain. Tasmania is, in many ways, a different country from the rest of Australia. It is colder, it is wetter, it is greener, it is much, much smaller, and it is, geologically, much, much younger. While the mainland of Australia has been quietly weathering for hundreds of millions and sometimes billions of years, Tasmania has been actively shaped much more recently by colliding plates and erupting magma and grinding glaciers in ways that have left their fingerprints all over the surface of the island. There are mountains in Tasmania that look exactly the way that mountains in your imagination are supposed to look: sharp, pointed, snow-capped in the winter, walled around the bottom with thick, dark green forest, cradled with steep glacial valleys full of cold, clear lakes, and the Eyre, in the high country, has the kind of edge to it that you do not really find anywhere on the mainland. The most famous of these mountains, the one that has been chosen, more often than any other, as the symbol of the Tasmanian wilderness, is called Cradle Mountain. And Cradle Mountain, despite being one of the more conventionally mountainous mountains on the entire continent, still does something that, when you stand at the base of it and you look up, feels strange. Cradle Mountain rises 1,545 meters above sea level. It sits at the northern end of a Great World Heritage Area called the Cradle Mountain Lake St. Clair National Park, which stretches for more than 80 kilometers south through some of the most rugged country in the southern hemisphere. The mountain is made of dolerite, a hard, dark volcanic rock that was injected in molten form into older sedimentary layers about 170 million years ago, when this part of the world was still attached to Antarctica. The dolerite cooled very slowly beneath the surface, and as it cooled, it cracked into a pattern of vertical regular columns, in the same way that the famous Giant's Causeway in Ireland is cracked into vertical columns, although on a much, much larger scale. The columns of Cradle Mountain are, in some places, almost a meter across. They run, more or less straight up and down, for the entire upper section of the mountain. They give the peak its strange, jagged, almost serrated profile, and they make the upper slopes of Cradle Mountain look, from a distance, less like a single peak and more like a row of enormous vertical columnar stones, all standing close together at the top of the ridge. The official explanation, of course, says that all of this is the work of straightforward geology. Dolerite intrusions form columnar joints as they cool. The columns in this case were exposed when the softer sedimentary rocks above them were eroded away over the past 170 million years. And during the most recent ice age, which ended only about 10,000 years ago, glaciers carved into the upper slopes of the mountain, removing softer material and leaving the harder columns sticking up at the top, like a row of stone teeth at the edge of a great cold mouth. The whole thing, the textbook says, is a perfectly ordinary example of glacially modified columnar dolerite. There are similar mountains elsewhere in Tasmania. There are similar formations, on a smaller scale, in many parts of the world. There is no need to invoke any unusual process. And the textbook is, again, almost certainly correct in its broad outlines. The columns really are columns. The dolerite really is dolerite. The glaciers really did pass over this country 10,000 years ago and shape it into the form you see today. But the way the columns stand at the summit, all of them at almost the same height, all of them perfectly vertical, all of them shoulder to shoulder along the top of the ridge, gives the mountain a particular kind of architectural quality that is hard to ignore. It looks, when you photograph it from the right angle, less like a peak and more like a wall of stone, a wall that has been broken down over thousands of years from a much greater height until only the bottom course of stones is still standing. as if Cradle Mountain were not really a mountain at all, in the way that the textbook describes, but the surviving lower section of a much larger structure, whose upper sections have been removed by glaciers, by weather, by time. The Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples, the original inhabitants of the island, who lived in this country for at least 40,000 years before the British arrived, do not have, as far as the surviving records show, an extensive set of named stories about Cradle Mountain in the way that the mainland peoples have stories about Uluru and Wollongong. This is partly because so much of the cultural knowledge of the Tasmanian peoples was destroyed in the long, brutal, sustained violence of the colonial period. But there are fragments, there are scraps of song, there are place names, and the place names for the high country of central Tasmania are full of words that translate, very approximately, as standing stones or as broken backs, or as the place where the sky was held up by stones that fell. The names suggest, in the careful, indirect way that very old place names so often do, that the people who lived under these mountains thought of them as the remains of something, as columns, as pillars, as the structural members of a roof that, somehow, somewhere along the way, was lost. You walk to the base of Cradle Mountain in the early morning, on the famous track that runs along the edge of Dove Lake, and the first thing you notice is the silence. There are no cicadas in this part of the country, the way there are on the mainland. There are very few birds at this elevation. The wind is the only sound, moving through the button grass and the pencil pines and the low dark scrub that covers the lower slopes of the mountain. The air is cold, even in summer. The water of the lake is so clear that you can see the round brown stones on the bottom, 4 or 5 meters down, as if the water were not even there. And the columns of Cradle Mountain rise out of the slope above the lake, in a long row of dark vertical shapes, set against a sky that, on a clear morning, is the deepest, coldest, most achingly perfect blue that any sky on Earth can produce. You stand there, with the air rasping in your throat, and you look up, and you feel, in a way that all the textbook explanations cannot quite reach, that the columns are too regular, too uniform, too much like a row of pillars whose lintels have, very long ago, fallen down. The mountain breathes very slowly. The lake holds the reflection of the columns, perfectly steady in its black water. And the morning passes, and the light slowly changes, and the columns wait, the way they have been waiting for 170 million years, for someone to come along and ask the question they were always going to be asked. Number 16, the Stirling Range. Far down on the southern coast of Western Australia, about 350 kilometres southeast of Perth, in a part of the country that gets cold winds straight off the Antarctic Ocean, there is a single, narrow, isolated mountain range that, when you see it for the first time, does not look like it should be there. It is called the Stirling Range. It runs for about 65 kilometres in an almost perfectly straight line, oriented from west-northwest to east-southeast, across an otherwise flat, gentle, agricultural country full of wheat and canola fields. The range is about 10 kilometres wide at its widest point. Its highest peak, called Bluff Knoll, rises 1,099 metres above sea level, which makes it the tallest mountain in southern Western Australia. From a distance, especially when there is fog or low cloud across the wheat fields, the Stirling Range looks like a long, low ship sailing across a green sea, with its mast and rigging and the dark vertical lines of its peaks all set against the sky and the wheat fields parting smoothly around its hull as it passes. The range is a national park. It is a famous birding area. It is one of the most botanically diverse places in Australia, with more endemic plant species per square kilometre than almost anywhere else in the country. And it is, for a tightly scattered handful of geologists who have spent their careers thinking about the deep history of southwestern Australia, a place that does not quite fit. The official explanation for the Stirling Range goes like this. The rocks of the range are very old, around 1 billion to 1.2 billion years old by the most current estimates. They are mostly hard, metamorphosed sandstones and quartzites, originally deposited as sediments in a great basin that no longer exists, and later cooked and squeezed by the heat and pressure of mountain-building events that have long since gone quiet. The textbook says that after the original sediments were laid down and then squeezed and heated into hard metamorphic rock, the entire region was uplifted and then eroded and then uplifted again and then eroded again and so on, through several long cycles of geological activity, until the surrounding country was worn down to its current, gentle, almost featureless level, while the harder rocks of what is now the Stirling Range, being more resistant, remained as a single long narrow ridge. It is, the textbook insists, a normal example of differential erosion, hard rocks left standing, soft rocks worn away. The same process you see in dozens of mountain ranges around the world, scaled up and stretched out over billions of years. And again, you cannot really argue with the textbook explanation because the timescales are impossible to test against, and the rock types are exactly what the textbook says they should be. But again, when you actually drive up to the foot of the range and you stand at the bottom of one of the access tracks, and you look up at the wall of mountains in front of you, you cannot quite shake the impression that something is not right. The range is too narrow, it is too straight. The peaks are too uniform in height. The eastern end stops almost abruptly in a pair of sharp spires called the Eastern Heights. The western end stops in a similarly sharp formation. Between the two ends, the ridge runs almost without a break, with peak after peak after peak, all of them jagged, all of them dark, all of them pointing upward into the sky in a kind of disciplined formation. From the air, the range looks like a single, long, vertical wall that has been pushed up out of the surrounding plain, as if a great section of the earth had been quietly extruded, all at once in a single neat line. The wheat fields lap up against its base, the dirt roads curve around its ends. The whole formation has the look of a thing that was placed. The Noongar people of southwestern Australia have called the range, in various dialects of their language, by names that translate as the Windcatcher, or the place of mists, or, more strikingly, the line where the country was broken. They have stories about the range that connect it to the great ancestor Mudacha, who walked through the country in the dreaming, and who, in the longest version of the story, was challenged by a series of other beings, and was struck across the back, and bled, and the line of his blood, falling into the dirt, became the line of the Stirling Range. The peaks in this story are the lumps of his vertebrae, where the blow fell hardest. The valleys between the peaks are the places where the blow only grazed him. It is a very specific story. It is much more specific than most of the dreaming stories about mountain ranges. And the specificity of it, the careful identification of which peak is which vertebra, suggests that the people who composed the story were not merely admiring the beauty of the range. They were trying to explain something about it, why it stood there alone on the empty wheat country, why it was so straight, why it was so narrow, why every peak was at almost the same height as every other peak, why the line of the range looked, when you step back from it, exactly as if a long, deep cut had been made into the surface of the earth, and the earth had been left to heal around the wound. You climb Bluff Knoll on a cool autumn morning, and the track winds up through Banksia and Dryandra and grass tree forest, and the air gets thinner and the wind gets colder, and the views back across the wheat country get larger and larger, until eventually you are standing on a narrow, wind-blown summit with a long sheer drop on the southern side, and the ridge of the range running away from you in both directions, west and east, peak after peak after peak, all of them at almost exactly your eye level. You can see from the summit that the country to the south of the range, all the way to the cold blue line of the Southern Ocean, is essentially flat. The country to the north, all the way to the inland, is also essentially flat. There is the range, and then there is nothing. The wind moves over the summit with a long, steady, ocean-cold sound. The lichens on the rocks at your feet are coloured pale grey and rusty orange, and as you look along the ridge, and your eye traces the perfectly straight line of peaks running east into the morning haze, you can almost see, just for a moment, the shape of what might once have been there. The wall, the line, the thing that was cut. Number 17. Mount Gambier. In the southeastern corner of South Australia, very close to the border with Victoria, in a piece of country that is gentle, green, full of small dairy farms and pine plantations, and the rolling, almost European-looking hills that you so rarely see anywhere else on the continent, there sits a town called Mount Gambier. The town is named after the mountain, and the mountain is named after a British admiral, and neither of those facts is particularly important. What is important is that the mountain itself, the geological feature that the town is built on the slopes of, is one of the most strikingly anomalous landforms in the entire country. From a distance, Mount Gambier looks like a low, broad, gently rounded hill. It rises only 190 meters above the surrounding plain. It is not steep. It is not particularly tall. It does not, at first glance, seem to belong on any list of unusual Australian landforms. But when you drive up to the rim of the mountain and you park your car and you walk to the lookout, what you see on the other side of the rim is something that almost no one is prepared for. The mountain is hollow. The top of it has been carved out in a perfectly circular bowl, more than a kilometer across, with steep walls and a flat floor, and at the bottom of the bowl there is a lake, a round, perfectly circular lake. And the lake is bright blue, not the pale blue of most Australian lakes, not the muddy brown blue of the inland salt pans, not the grey-green blue of the southern coastal waters. The lake is, for about half of every year, a deep, vivid, almost luminous cobalt blue, the colour of a paint chip in a hardware store, the colour of a stained glass window in a cathedral, the colour that almost no natural body of water on Earth ever actually is. The locals call it the Blue Lake. It is the most photographed lake in South Australia, and it sits there in the centre of its perfectly circular crater, doing the impossible thing every summer, with a stillness that does not really feel like the stillness of natural water. The official explanation is that Mount Gambier is a maar volcano. A maar, in volcanic terminology, is a low, broad volcanic crater that forms when rising magma encounters groundwater near the surface, producing a violent steam explosion that blasts a circular hole in the country and leaves behind a low rim of debris around the edges. The maar at Mount Gambier was formed by the most recent estimates somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 years ago, which makes it one of the youngest volcanoes anywhere on the Australian mainland. There were probably people living in the area at the time of the eruption. The Bungle people, the traditional owners of this country, have stories about a great noise in the country, and a great fire, and a great hole in the ground that was left behind, and the stories are detailed enough, and the geology is recent enough, that they may very well be eyewitness accounts of the actual event, passed down through more than 250 generations. The Bungle say that the mountain is the home of an ancestor named Cradle, who came down to the country with his family looking for a place to live, and who tried several times to make his home in the surrounding hills, but was driven out each time by the bird messengers of an enemy spirit, until eventually he made his home at the Blue Lake, where he could see in every direction and could not be surprised. The Bungle say that Cradle still lives there, that the lake belongs to him, that the strange deep blue color, which appears each summer and disappears each winter, is connected in some way to his moods or his presence or his attention. They will tell you in some versions of the story that the lake was once much, much deeper than it is today, that the bottom of it was once a great long way down, that the floor of the bowl, the whole flat surface of it, has been pushed up very gradually over the last few thousand years by something living that wants to come closer to the surface. The official explanation handles all of this without too much trouble. The color of the water, the geologists will say, is a result of microscopic calcium carbonate particles that precipitate out of the lake every spring, when the water warms above a certain temperature, and which scatter the blue light from the sky in such a way that the lake appears, for a few months each year, to be the color of pure cobalt. The flatness of the floor is a result of sediment settling out over the past several thousand years. The roundness of the bowl is the result of the explosion that formed the maar in the first place, scaled down by the slow weathering of the rim. It is, the textbook says, a perfectly ordinary maar volcano, only a few thousand years old, and the strangeness of its appearance is just the strangeness of any well-preserved, recently formed volcanic crater. There is no mystery. There is no missing structure. There is just a hole in the ground and a lake at the bottom, and a particularly photogenic combination of geology and chemistry and the angle of the southern light. But again, when you stand on the rim of the bowl and you look down at the lake, and you see how perfectly circular it is, and how deep blue and how strangely smooth the surface of the water is, even on days when the wind is moving across the surrounding hills, the official explanation seems to skim across the top of the place without quite settling into it, as if the official explanation were a kind of polite paint brushed across an older and stranger surface, to make the surface easier for the modern world to look at, because the geometry of the bowl is too clean, the walls are too steep, the lake is too round, the whole formation, when you photograph it from the air, looks less like an explosion crater and more like a deliberate excavation, as if the top of the original mountain had been, at some point, scooped out in a perfectly circular section, and the resulting bowl had then filled with rainwater and groundwater, and the rainwater and groundwater had, by whatever combination of chemistry and biology and luck, turned a color that looks, when you photograph it next to the surrounding green farmland, almost like a jewel set into the front of the country. The rim of the crater, viewed from the air, has the same uniform height all the way around, the way the rim of a teacup has the same height all the way around. The walls fall away from the rim with the same uniform steepness on every side. The bottom is flat, and the lake, in summer, is the color of a stained glass cathedral window. The Bungle, when they tell the story of Cradle, do not say that the top of the mountain was cut off. They say that the country was changed by a great event, by fire, by noise, by a hole that was opened in the ground. The official version says it was a steam explosion. The local version says it was Cradle making his home. And neither version, perhaps, fully accounts for the impossible, almost ornamental neatness of what you're actually looking at. Number 18, Lake Eyre. We have, in this long walk together, looked at 16 places where the surface of the country seems to be holding the memory of something larger that has been removed. We have looked at the stumps, the ridges, the cores, the walls, the columns, the rings. We have looked in each case at what is left, and we have asked very quietly whether the official explanation is really sufficient to account for the shape of the thing. There is one more place to visit before we let the night close in around us completely. One more piece of country that, in some ways, is the strangest of them all. Because what we are about to look at is not a mountain, it is not a peak. It is not a column or a ridge or a wall of stone. What we are about to look at is a hole, the largest, lowest, flattest, emptiest, most consistently empty hole in the entire continent. A hole so vast that the human mind cannot really hold the size of it without breaking up into smaller, more manageable pieces. The hole has a name. On the maps, it is called Lake Eyre. The traditional owners of the country, the Arabana people, have a different name. They call it Kata Tjuta, and whatever you call it, it is the most concentrated piece of empty space, the most undeniable absence anywhere on the surface of Australia. Lake Eyre, on a map, looks like a very large, slightly oblong pale blue area in the centre of South Australia, about 700 kilometres north of Adelaide. Its longest dimension is about 144 kilometres. Its widest dimension is about 77 kilometres. It is, by area, the largest lake in Australia and one of the largest lakes in the world. It is also, by surface elevation, the lowest point on the entire continent, at about 15 metres below sea level, and it is, almost all of the time, completely dry, because Lake Eyre is not really a lake in the way that a lake is normally a lake. It is a salt pan, a vast, flat, white, blinding plain of dried mud and crystallized salt, stretching from horizon to horizon under a sky that, for most of the year, has no clouds in it at all. It fills with water only rarely. Once every 8 or 10 years, after exceptional rainfall in the catchment far to the north, in central Queensland, the rivers that feed into Lake Eyre, the Diamantina and the Cooper and the Georgina, will deliver enough water down their long, dry, sandy beds to actually reach the lake. And the lake will fill briefly in a great shallow mirror flat sheet of pale water, and the country will explode into life, with millions of birds arriving from all directions to breed on the temporary islands of the rising water. And then the sun and the wind and the long hot summer will, over the course of a few months, evaporate the water back away, and the lake will return to its usual condition, which is empty, cracked, white, silent, the largest, hottest, flattest, most unforgiving piece of nothing in the whole country. And here is the question that no one really asks. When they stand at the edge of Lake Eyre and they look out across the burning white plain and they feel the heat coming up off the dried salt at them in waves, the question is not, where did all this water go? The question is, where did all this material go? Because Lake Eyre is not just a lake, it is a basin. The Lake Eyre Basin, as it is called on the geological maps, is a vast, deep structural depression in the centre of the Australian continent, covering more than 1.5 million square kilometres, or about 1/6 of the entire land area of Australia. It is one of the largest enclosed drainage basins in the world. The rivers that flow into it do not flow out of it. They simply dissipate as they reach the floor of the basin into the ancient sands and salts and dried clays of the centre. And the basin itself, when you look at it geologically, is not a normal feature of the continental surface. The country around the edges of the basin is, by Australian standards, relatively high. The Flinders Ranges to the south, the MacDonnell Ranges to the north, the Great Dividing Range to the east. The country dips in a great long shallow bowl from these surrounding highlands toward the centre, where Lake Eyre sits at the very bottom, as if a section of the continent in the middle had subsided or had been somehow removed. The official explanation, of course, is the slow and patient one. The Lake Eyre Basin formed, the geologists say, over hundreds of millions of years, through a combination of slow tectonic subsidence in the centre and slow uplift along the margins. The rivers that drain into the basin have been laying down sediments in the centre for a very long time, and the floor of the basin, beneath the salt and the cracked mud, is actually thousands of metres of accumulated sediment, slowly piling up over the deep ages in a structural low that has been a structural low since the very early stages of the formation of the continent. There is, the textbook says, no mystery. The basin is what it is, and it has been what it is for hundreds of millions of years. And the saltiness and the dryness are just the inevitable result of the climate of Central Australia, which is one of the driest climates on Earth, combined with the topography of the basin, which means that whatever water arrives has nowhere to go except up into the air, leaving its dissolved salts behind. And again, you cannot argue with the textbook. The dates are good, the sediments are real, the structural geology is well understood. But again, when you actually stand at the edge of the lake and you let your eye travel across the empty white floor all the way to the horizon, where the heat haze is shimmering above the salt like a slow pale fire, the textbook story does not quite hold the entire shape of what you're looking at. Because Lake Eyre, when you understand the size of it, and when you compare its size to all the flat-topped, cut-off, strangely diminished mountains we've just walked past on our long way here, looks less like a structural basin and more like a pit, a removal site, a great hollow place in the center of the continent, into which all the missing material from all the missing mountain ranges might, in some forgotten time, have been swept. As if the cuttings of Uluru and Kata Tjuta and Mount Augustus and Mount Connor, the rubble of the old Wollongong volcano, the missing upper layers of the Blue Mountains, the absent peaks of the Stirling Range, and the unaccounted cuttings of every other formation we have looked at, had all been gathered up very long ago and dumped in a single great central pile into the lowest part of the country, where they had then settled and compacted and been covered by salt and mud and time, and where they now lie undisturbed beneath the burning white surface of the modern lake. The Arabana people have stories about Kata Tjuta that connected to a great battle in the Dreaming, in which an ancestor was defeated, and his body was scattered across the country, and his blood ran down into the lowest place, where it dried and turned to salt, Where it sits now, very still, very white, very flat, in the center of the country, while the wind moves across it and the sky burns above it, and the country, in its long and patient way, refuses to forget. You do not stand at the edge of the lake for very long. The heat is too much, the brightness is too much, the strange, almost unbearable absence of any feature in any direction is too much. You go back to your vehicle, you drive away, and as the lake disappears in the rearview mirror, you feel, in the back of your mind, a question that you cannot quite shake. If something was once removed from this country, then this is where the something would have gone. If a continent was once trimmed down to the shape it has today, then this is where the trimmings would have been swept. The textbook will tell you very firmly that none of this is true. And the textbook is almost certainly correct. Almost certainly. But the lake remains, and the salt remains, and the long, slow, patient memory of the country remains. And in the silence above the white plain, which is the deepest silence anywhere on Earth, the question continues very quietly to ask itself. Number 19, Kings Canyon. About 300 kilometers southwest of Alice Springs in the Geological Range, in a stretch of the Northern Territory that almost no one visits unless they are very deliberately on their way there, the red plain of Central Australia rises, suddenly and without warning, into a long, flat-topped escarpment of pale orange and cream-coloured sandstone. The escarpment is not particularly high, it is not particularly long. It is not, by any of the measures that the tourism brochures usually care about, a major piece of country, but somewhere along the line of the escarpment, the rock has been split open by something into a great rectangular gash that runs back into the body of the range for nearly a kilometre. The walls of the gash are sheer, they drop in places 300 metres straight down, with no slopes, no curves, no soft transitions. The floor of the gash at the bottom is sandy and forested, and threaded with a small permanent creek, in pools so clear that you can see the white sand under the water from the lookouts on the rim. The whole place, in the language of the Luritja people who have always lived here, is called Watarka. The English name, which is what you will see on the maps, is Kings Canyon. And whatever you call it, the thing is profoundly, almost unsettlingly strange. The official explanation says that Kings Canyon was carved by a small river over the past 20 million years or so, cutting downward into the soft moraine sandstone of the Geological Range, as the country was very slowly uplifted. There is, the textbook says, a creek running along the bottom of the canyon today, and you can see even now the work of erosion in the slow way the creek meanders across the canyon floor and cuts at the base of the cliffs in the wet season. The harder layers of sandstone at the top of the rim have resisted erosion better than the softer layers underneath, and so you end up with a canyon whose walls are vertical, with a hard cap rock along the top and slightly undercut along the bottom, in the way that many sandstone canyons in many parts of the world are undercut along the bottom. It is, the geologists insist, a perfectly ordinary example of a sandstone gorge, slightly larger and slightly more spectacular than most, but in no way mysterious. And again, you cannot really argue with the textbook because the rock types and the river dynamics are exactly what they should be, and the timescales are sufficient, just barely, to account for the cutting. But again, when you stand at the edge of the rim and you look down into the canyon, the textbook story does not quite fit the evidence in front of your eyes, because the walls are too vertical, they are too flat, they are too clean. The corners of the canyon, where the rock turns from one orientation to another, are sharp, almost geometric, in a way that running water does not normally produce. The cap rock at the top of the rim is so uniform in thickness, so unbroken, so perfectly horizontal that it looks almost like a layer of poured concrete that has been laid down across the entire range. And on the rim itself, on the broad, flat, sunburnt plateau that surrounds the canyon, there is a feature that the rangers will steer you toward as soon as you arrive, because everyone sooner or later wants to see it. The feature has a name. The early surveyors called it the Lost City. It is a field of dome-shaped formations, hundreds of them, some of them small, some of them as large as houses, all of them rounded, all of them weathered into the same beehive shape that you have already seen at the Bungle Bungles, all of them sitting on a perfectly flat, gently sloping pavement of sandstone in arrangements that look, when you walk among them in the late afternoon, exactly like the foundations of a large abandoned settlement. There are streets between the domes, or what look like streets. Wide, smooth, flat-floored avenues that run between rows of beehive-shaped buildings, with the domes set close together along the sides. There are squares where the streets intersect. There are smaller domes that look like outbuildings, and larger ones that look like main structures. The whole place has the appearance, when you walk through it slowly, of a city that has been weathered for so long that the buildings have lost all their detail, but kept their basic shapes, like a sandcastle that has been left out overnight in a light rain. The official explanation handles the lost city the way it handles every other unusual sandstone formation we have seen on this walk. The domes, the geologists say, are simply the result of the same vertical and horizontal jointing in the sandstone that produced the canyon walls, combined with the same slow weathering that has been working on the rock for tens of millions of years. The streets between the domes are simply the lines of the joints, which have been preferentially weathered out because water and air can attack the rock more easily along the joint plains. There is no city. There is no settlement. There are only joints and water and the long patient action of time and the resulting pattern of rounded blocks separated by grid-like channels. And again, the explanation is, in its broad outlines, almost certainly correct. There was a sandstone plateau, there were joints in the sandstone, the joints have been weathered, the blocks between the joints have been rounded. There is no need to invoke any other process. But again, when you walk through the lost city in the late afternoon, with the warm orange light slanting between the domes, and the shadows stretching long across the smooth pavements, the geological explanation does not quite fill the space that the place itself opens up in your mind, because the streets are too straight, they are too uniform in width, the intersections are too clean, the domes are too regularly shaped, too consistently spaced, too obviously arranged. You stand at the center of one of the broader pavements, with rows of dome-shaped formations on either side, and you cannot quite shake the feeling that you are standing in a town square, that this pavement beneath your feet was once the floor of a marketplace, that the rounded shapes around you, weathered and silent and rusted by the long heat of 10 million summers, were once the walls of buildings, full of light and noise and the small daily sounds of a community. The Luritja people, who have hunted on this country for 40,000 years, will not exactly say this. It is not their tradition to make claims about the deep past. But the songs they sing about Wadarka, the songs that have been passed down through more generations than anyone alive today can count, treat the canyon and the lost city with a particular kind of reverence that, in their tradition, is reserved for places where something happened, where something was made, where something was, perhaps, lost. You walk back toward the lookout in the long, slow shadow of the late afternoon, and the colors of the rock deepen, and the sky above the canyon goes from blue to gold to the color of a slow-burning ember, and you stand at the edge and you look down at the White Sand Creek bed at the bottom of the canyon, and the Garden of Eden waterhole hidden in the trees at the canyon's far end, and you think, just for a moment, about all the long, quiet years that this country has been waiting. About the patience of the stone, about the way the cap rock has held its flatness, layer after layer for hundreds of millions of years, while everything around it has slowly been carried away. The wind moves through the spinifex at your feet with a long, slow sighing sound. A wedge-tail eagle drifts across the canyon, very high up, with its wings spread, hanging on a thermal that rises out of the heated walls of the canyon like the breath of the country itself. And you turn and you walk back toward your vehicle, and the sun goes down behind you, and the lost city, with its streets and its domes and its silent intersections, goes back to whatever long, slow, patient business it has been doing in the centuries between visitors. Nothing has changed. The textbook explanation still holds. The country, as far as anyone can prove, was never a city. The streets were never streets. The buildings were never buildings. And yet, when you fall asleep that night, in your tent or your vehicle or the small comfortable room of your roadhouse motel, the streets and the buildings will come into your dreams, and they will be busy, they will be full, and the people moving through them will be tall and dark-eyed and patient, and they will not pay you any particular attention as you walk past, because they have been there much longer than you, and they will be there much longer still after you have gone. Number 20, the Hamersley. We come, at the end of this long walk, to one final place. A place where the cutting is no longer hypothetical, no longer something you have to imagine, no longer something the textbooks explain away. A place where the cutting is happening right now, in front of you, on a scale so vast that the satellites of the modern world have to keep adjusting their maps to keep up with it. The Pilbara, or more precisely, the Hamersley Range, in the central part of the Pilbara, in the northwestern corner of Western Australia, a region of red rock and sparse spinifex and thin scattered eucalypts, where the temperature in summer regularly exceeds 45 degrees Celsius, and the air shimmers above the iron-red ground like the air above a stove. The Hamersley Range is one of the largest and oldest sources of iron in the world. The rocks here, the famous banded iron formations, are about 2.5 billion years old, give or take. They were laid down in shallow seas, in horizontal layers, when the atmosphere of the Earth was still in the long, slow process of becoming oxygenated, and when iron, which had been dissolved in the oceans for 1 billion years, was finally beginning to precipitate out as a result of the activity of early photosynthetic life. The iron settled in alternating bands, layer by layer, over a span of millions of years, until it had built up into deposits that are, in some places, hundreds of meters thick. Then the seas drained away, the layers were lifted up, the country was eroded for 2 billion years, and what remains today is a region of red, iron-rich mountains stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the empty north of Western Australia. These mountains, when they were first surveyed by Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were noted as having more or less flat tops. The Hamersley Range, in its original form, was a long, broad plateau-like region, with rounded summits, gentle slopes, and a great covering of low spinifex and scattered eucalyptus and acacia. It looked, in old photographs, very much like the rest of the Central Australian highlands. It looked, in fact, like the kind of country that we have been describing throughout this entire long story. Flat-topped, cut off at a uniform height, sitting on top of a vast, ancient, weathered plain. And in the middle of the 20th century, when modern industrial mining technology arrived, the Hamersley Range began to be cut down, literally, mountain by mountain, layer by layer, carried away in trucks the size of small houses, loaded onto trains that are sometimes more than 2.5 kilometers long, and shipped, one boat after another, out of the Pilbara ports of Port Hedland and Dampier and Cape Lambert, to the steel mills of China and Japan and Korea. The iron ore of the Pilbara is one of the foundations of the modern industrial world. Without it, there would be no skyscrapers, there would be no bridges, there would be no cars, there would be no shipping containers. The cities of the 21st century are, in a very literal sense, built out of the iron of these mountains, and the mountains accordingly are disappearing. There are mountains in the Pilbara that have been entirely removed. Hill after hill, peak after peak, has been cut off at the base, ground up, hauled away, and converted into steel. There are open cut pits in some places that are kilometers across and hundreds of meters deep where mountains used to stand. From the Eyre in the most heavily mined areas, the country is a maze of stepped excavations and red dust roads and long conveyor belts and the distant flares of haul trucks moving from pit to crusher to train. The mining companies, with the consent of the Western Australian government and with negotiated agreements with the traditional Aboriginal owners of the country, are quite legally taking entire mountains apart in the name of the world economy and shipping them overseas. They have been doing this for somewhere between 50 and 70 years. They will, by the most current projections, continue to do this for at least another 50 to 100 years. By the time the iron of the Hamersley is exhausted, the entire range will be unrecognizable from its original form. There will be valleys where there were once ridges. There will be holes where there were once peaks. The country, which had stood essentially still for 2.5 billion years, will have been dramatically remodeled in the span of a single human lifetime. And here, finally, you might begin to wonder, if we, in this single short time, with our trucks and our trains and our crushing plants, can take down a mountain range and ship it away across the seas and turn it into the buildings and bridges of a distant city, then what would have stopped some other group in some other long-vanished period of the country's history from doing the same thing? The textbook will say immediately that there were no humans here who could have done such a thing. That before the recent industrial era, the land was inhabited only by hunter-gatherers with stone tools who could not possibly have removed a mountain. And the textbook is right, at least about the Aboriginal peoples of the recent past, who have always lived very lightly on this country, and who have left almost no physical trace on the landscape, except for the long, careful patterns of fire management that have shaped the vegetation of the entire continent for tens of thousands of years. But the question, in its largest form, does not really go away. If a mountain can be cut down in our time by us, then a mountain can be cut down. The capability exists. The act is possible. And once you know that, once you have stood at the edge of one of the great Pilbara mining pits and watched the haul trucks crawling up out of the bottom of what used to be a hill, you cannot quite look at the rest of the Australian continent in the same way again. You cannot quite look at the flat top of Uluru or the level summit of Mount Connor, or the ring of peaks around Wollongong, or the disciplined line of the Stirling Range, or the clean-cut walls of Karlu Karlu, or the regular fields of the Bungle Bungles, without thinking, somewhere in the back of your mind, that the cutting capability has always been the question, and not the cutting itself. That if the cutting can be done by anyone at any scale, then somewhere in the long unwitnessed past of this enormous quiet country, it might already have been done by someone, for some reason, with some purpose. That has, like everything else from those vanished times, been weathered out of the surface of the world, and left behind nothing but the shape of the wound. You stand at the lookout in the late afternoon, with the haul trucks far below moving in their slow, patient circles, and the dust rising in long, pale clouds against the deepening red of the evening sky. And you watch a single mountain disappear, very slowly, one truckload at a time, into the holds of a ship that is even now waiting in the harbour at Port Hedland for the iron to come down out of the country. And you think about the other mountains, the older ones, the ones we visited at the start of this long walk together, and you wonder whether they too were, in some forgotten time, the destinations of some other set of trucks, some other set of trains, some other patient industrial process, run by someone whose name no one now remembers. The Pilbara is the obvious version of the cutting, the recent version, the version that everyone can see. The other versions, the older versions, are quieter. They have had longer to weather. They have given the country a chance to grow grass over them, and to settle the dust, and to fade the edges until the cuts no longer look like cuts, and the wounds no longer look like wounds, and the only thing left on the surface is the strange, persistent flatness of the tops, and the strange, persistent verticality of the sides, and the long, slow song of the people who remember. The song says, in many languages, in many places, all across the continent, that the country was once different, was once larger, was once taller, was once whole, and that something happened, and that the something has been hidden since by the patient work of 2.5 billion years. So now you have the 19 places, or 20 if we are generous, and count the Pilbara, which is the 20th, and which is also, in another sense, all of them. You have walked the long red road from Uluru to Kata Tjuta to Mount Augustus, and the Bungle Bungles and Mount Connor, and Wilpenna Pound, and the Glasshouse Mountains, and the MacDonnells and Karlu Karlu, and the Pinnacles and Wollomben, and the Blue Mountains and Wave Rock, and the Kimberley and Cradle Mountain, and the Stirling Range, and the strange blue eye of Mount Gambier, and the burning white silence of Kata Tjuta, and the silent streets of the lost city at Watarka, and you have ended at the disappearing iron mountains of the Pilbara. You have seen the patterns, the flat tops, the vertical walls, the ridges that run too straight, the valleys that are too uniform, the fields of stone that look too much like the foundations of cities, the single isolated peaks that look too much like the cores of structures whose outer walls have been removed, the clean circular bowls that look too much like deliberate excavations, the vast central depression that looks too much like the place where everything else might have been swept. You have heard, very quietly, the voices of the people who have lived under and around these formations for 40, 50, 60,000 years, and the careful, layered, often beautiful stories they tell about the country. You have heard the textbooks too, with their long, slow, patient explanations involving uplift and erosion and tectonic forces and the deep grinding action of weather across the immeasurable spans of geological time. And you have heard, finally, the third voice, which is not the voice of the textbooks and not exactly the voice of the elders either, but something that sits very quietly somewhere in between. The voice that says, when you stand at the foot of one of these flat-topped, sheer-walled, isolated formations, that the country is a witness, that the country has been here for a very long time, and that the country, whatever it has seen in all those long ages, is in no real hurry to tell. It will tell when it is ready, and not before. For now, the country sleeps, the red dust settles, the wind moves slowly across the spinifex. The stars come out, one by one, in numbers that you have probably never seen, in skies darker than any other skies on Earth. The stones cool, very slowly, after the long heat of the day, and somewhere in the soft folds of your blankets, your breathing has begun to deepen, and your body has begun to grow heavier, and the words of this story have begun to slip, very gently, out of your conscious mind, and down into the deep reservoirs of sleep where dreams are made. Think, if you can still think at all, about what you've just walked through. A continent that has been quietly weathering in the southern hemisphere for longer than any other continent on the planet. A landmass that has not had a major tectonic upheaval in hundreds of millions of years, and that has, accordingly, been giving up its mountains, very slowly, very patiently, to the long action of wind and rain and sun. A country whose surface, when you look at it from above, is dotted all over with the strange, persistent shapes that we have just spent 2 hours walking past. The flat tops, the sheer walls, the isolated columns, the clean circular bowls, the straight line ridges, the fields of round stones, the deep central basin into which a continent's worth of cuttings might, in some long forgotten time, have once been swept. And whether all of this is, as the textbooks insist, the result of nothing more than the patient work of weather over impossibly long spans of time, or whether some part of it is, as the older voices of the country sometimes seem to suggest, the result of something more deliberate, you will not be able to decide tonight. You will not be able to decide it tomorrow either. You may not be able to decide it at all in the brief span of years that is given to you. The country has been waiting for 2.5 billion years to be understood. It is not in a hurry. It will still be there in the morning, in the afternoon, in the long, slow centuries that follow. The flat tops will still be flat. The sheer walls will still be sheer. The lake at the center will still be empty. And the wind will still be moving across its white surface in the same long, patient sigh that it has been making for thousands of years. Tomorrow in the morning, you will wake up and you will not remember most of what was said. You will remember perhaps the color of the rock at sunset. You will remember perhaps the long flatness of the desert plain. You will remember perhaps the cold blue of the morning sky over Cradle Mountain, or the warm honey of the late light on the Three Sisters, or the strange vinous glow of the domes of Kata Tjuta in the last few minutes before the sun goes down. You may remember very faintly the round blue eye of Mount Gambier, or the burning white silence at the center of Kata Tjuta, or the long disciplined line of the Stirling Range running out into the morning haze, or the silent stone streets of the lost city at Watarka under the slanting late afternoon light. The rest will be gone. And that is all right. The mountains will still be there. The country will still be waiting. The story will be ready the next time you need it. In the same shape it has always been, very slowly, very patiently, the way the country itself is patient. Think, just before sleep takes you completely, about how small a span of time the human story really is, set against the country we have just walked through, 60,000 years of human presence on this continent. 250 years of European observation, less than 100 years of detailed geological mapping, less than 50 years of satellite imagery. And the country itself, the rocks underneath you, the long shadows of the ranges, the silent floor of the central basin, all of it, much of it, is 2.5 billion years old, 40,000 human generations. 400 million if we are counting in some other, larger unit of time. The country has been waiting, very patiently, through almost half the history of the planet, for someone to notice the shape of its silence. And the shape of its silence is exactly what we have been walking through tonight. The flatness on top, the straight walls, the clean cuts, the strange persistent absence of debris, the long quiet plains where mountains should still be standing, the deep central depression into which a continent's worth of cuttings might, in some forgotten time, have been swept and packed down and buried under salt. You may not believe a word of what we have said tonight. You may believe, when you wake up in the morning, that all of this was nothing more than the patient work of weather and time, exactly as the textbooks say it was. You may believe that the textbooks are right, that the only things that have ever happened on this continent are the things that the geologists describe, and that the human stories we have told along the way are nothing more than the imaginative responses of small mammals trying to make sense of country much older and stranger than themselves. Or you may believe, when the morning comes, that the textbooks are missing something, that the long memory of the country, carried in the songs and the place names of the people who have lived on it for 60,000 years, contains a real piece of information that the textbooks have not yet found a way to translate. You do not have to choose tonight. You only have to listen. The country is patient enough to wait for whatever choice you eventually make. The country is patient enough to wait for whatever choice the species eventually makes. And in the long, long centuries that lie ahead of us, the flat tops will still be flat, and the silence at the center will still be empty, and the wind will still be moving across the country with the same slow, sighing voice that it has been making for longer than any of us have any way to imagine. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and whatever you dream in the long, quiet hours of the night, may the dust and the stone and the long red distance of the Australian interior come to you and walk with you and lay you gently down in a country that is older than every story that has ever been told about it, and that will outlast every story that will ever be told about it again. The flat tops will keep their flatness. The sheer walls will keep their verticality. The columns will keep standing in their long, disciplined rows. The basin at the center will keep its silence. And the wind, the same wind that has been moving across this country for longer than any human voice has been singing in it, will keep moving, very gently, very patiently, all the way to the morning. Good night.